Hello and welcome to the Museum and Heritage Autumn Season's talks and webinars. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch our video today. Today's discussion, you're going to get a lot of information and you'll be able to use that in your tourist attraction regarding our topic today. But before we get into that, let me introduce myself. My name is Carlton Gadjadar and I'm going to be hosting today's panel discussion. I've been blessed enough to work in the tourist attractions industry for about 20 years now, and currently I'm opening new attractions worldwide for the general public. I've just recently come back from Kuwait and opened 2 landmark museums for the country as well. So today we're going to dive into the world of crisis management. As attractions, we know about crisis management, but COVID has completely changed the way that we've had to approach a crisis. So this talk is not necessarily going to be talking about crisis management and COVID, but generally talking about different areas of crisis management that you may not have particularly thought about. So this leads me to introducing our fantastic panel who will be sharing their experiences and top tips in this area for you. So let me introduce Rachel McKay from Q, Neil Dolan from the lastminute.com London Eye, and Nick Robbins from the Design Museum London. Welcome, everybody.
Hello. Good morning.
There you go. Thank you. Thanks for taking your time to come and talk on this session today. Before we start, I would like to go through each and one of you and just talk about your background and what you've done within the tourist attraction industry. So let's start with Rachel and we'll move on to Nick and then Neil.
Great. Thank you, Carlton. So I'm Rachel McKay, actually not McKay, but McKay, and I work for Historic Royal Palaces, which is the independent charity that looks after Hampton Court, Tower of London, but I manage the properties that are based in Kew Gardens. So that's Kew Palace, the Great Pagoda, Queen Charlotte's Cottage and the Royal Kitchens. At the moment, they're all shut. So I've been on furlough for quite a lot of the year, and I've spent the time building a website, which is designed to support museum and heritage professionals with recovering from COVID, I guess, in terms of the business, which is called the Recovery Room. And I've also been finishing off my master's in heritage management and focusing a lot on crisis management. So my research project was on how museums and heritage sites have crisis managed COVID. And so there's lots of great learnings that have come out of that hopefully will be really useful for this conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rachel. Nick?
Hi, I'm Nick Robbins. I'm the Visitor Operations Manager at the Design Museum over in London. It's a museum that's existed in 1 or 2 forms for the last 20 odd years or so. And my role there is to effectively translate the strategy for visitor experience and plan and deliver service. I have a focus on ticketing, on visitor flow through the building, effectively anything from your online start of your journey to leaving post sort of experience. Is sort of the area that I deal with. I've spent the last year or so working and on furlough as well. I guess most of us have been as well. It's been quite a lot of time for me to sort of reflect, think about the industry as a whole, think about how to sort of motivate teams and how to deal with people. I've been sort of accused on a number of occasions of being the people person too much. I don't know what that equates to, but probably the clown. But it's been a real eye-opening experience for me to deal with the human side of things, working with people across departments in a scenario that's unfolding, as well as dealing with my own team, managing those people, and sort of understanding how we can kind of work together to forge through, I suppose.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nick. And Neil?
Hi, so I'm Neil Dolan. I'm Head of Operations at the lastminute.com London Eye and also the London Eye River Cruise. So I've been in my current role for coming up to 3 years, and prior to that joined the London Eye back in 2013, where I actually had the pleasure of working with Carlton.
That's right.
During his stint at the London Eye. So And prior to that, I was still working for Mellon Entertainments up in Edinburgh, working at the Edinburgh Dungeon, sort of alongside my studies. And if one thing that studying chemistry taught me is that I don't want a career in chemistry. So was fully satisfied and excited to work in tourist attractions. And what the last sort of 6 to 12 months has been, and I think everyone who works in our industry would probably agree, it's probably been the biggest learning curve in our industry that we've ever seen. And the constant battle of how do we reopen an attraction with shifting guidance and changing parameters while trying to keep a team motivated, engaged. And I think just as we were getting there, we get another lockdown. So it's been a year that I don't think any of us will forget. And this webinar came up at a really good time, because we're in that reflection period again. We're going to have to pick ourselves up, and fingers crossed we get the green light to open when we do. And the more information that we can get out to everyone, sharing our experiences, so we can rebound as an industry, then absolutely the better. So really appreciate the opportunity, Carlton, for getting me onto this call.
Oh, no problem. I'm really honoured that everyone's on this panel. I think you guys are going to bring some really interesting thought processes and ideas to this conversation. So let's start with the first question. So I'm going to start with Rachel, if that's okay.
Sure.
And then everybody, if you just jump in with any other comments. So, okay, first question is, do senior managers need to manage a crisis, lead a crisis, or do both?
Okay, so I guess, yeah, so thinking about what people actually do in a crisis and what their roles are, I guess on a practical level, it's really good to have those defined roles in a crisis. And so if you look at, for example, the emergency services, you've always got that gold, silver, bronze kind of hierarchy of decision making and operational management. And the reason for that, I guess, is to make sure that there's no overlap and no confusion in terms of who's managing the crisis and who's on the ground and who's dealing with the operation. And so most museums have that sort of level within their crisis management structure as well. And I think that is a good thing to do, because it stops one person trying to do everything. But in the research that I did over the summer, specifically about COVID, it was really interesting how many people said that, yeah, we do have this crisis management team and structure, but actually when this happened, the director took over, or a senior manager just did everything. And it's almost like the crisis was so unexpected and so different from anything that we've experienced before, that it was kind of felt that this really high level leadership was required. And I think in some situations, people felt that was appropriate, but there were other situations where actually it caused a little bit of confusion in terms of the roles that people were doing and communication and who was meant to be doing what. So it's interesting that those lines, I guess, between sort of managing the crisis and leading the crisis sometimes got a little bit blurred in COVID. One thing that I think has been so important in terms of leadership has been visibility, particularly at a time where we can't be all together. Leaders have had to find ways of being visible during crises, whether it's, all staff briefings over Zoom, or actually going onto site, or, emails, or, just finding ways to make sure that leaders are visible has been a really important part of leadership during this crisis. But I think the difference with coronavirus has been that it's a completely different shape of crisis to anything that we've experienced before. It isn't just like a fire, which is over in a day and then you're rebuilding, and maybe a month, 6 months later, a year later, you're kind of back up to full business. Because this has been a much, much longer term crisis, I think if you are the person leading the crisis, you've got to be very aware of your limits and not always having the answers, because as we mentioned, the guidance is changing all the time. And also your own kind of energy levels. At the start, I don't think that any of us thought it was going to go on for as long as it has. And so you kind of think, well, I know I certainly thought, if a crisis happened, I would be on site at Q and I would deal with it and I would know what to do. As it happens, I wasn't on site for the majority of the pandemic, and actually nobody can go on for that long anyway. And that's only exacerbated by things like furlough, where actually the people who are still at work are having to take on a lot more from other people who are no longer there. So what's actually been really good about this new period of lockdown, which I know that sounds mad that it's good, but the fact that you can furlough people who haven't been furloughed before, is actually a really good opportunity to change the guard and sort of let people take a bit of a back seat. And so again, it becomes about not the personalities who are doing that leading and managing, but the roles, to make sure that you can pass over those roles to somebody else, pass on back a bit when energy levels are dipping. And that's a really important thing to think about when you have a long-term crisis, I think.
Awesome, thank you, Rachel. Neil or Nick?
Yeah, and the point you raised about fatigue is absolutely imperative, because this is such a long period, and the fire alarm example you give is what we would probably have considered a crisis before.
Sure.
You're talking maybe 2 hours of work. I think the stance on that leadership management style, when something is as high level and is impacting as this, actually, it does make sense for there to be one person who devises a strategy. But to your point, Rachel, that person who devises a strategy, they are not then going to be able to ensure that that entire strategy is delivered. So that is where, when you look at typical incident management structures, you look at the team around you, that leader needs to assign those roles and ensure that those people who are in those roles are following the strategy as required. And that's basic leader management. The bit which I think has been so important because we're basing our strategies off what the government is saying, is it's that leader's absolute responsibility to look back in, get feedback from those people who are managing their strategy on their behalf, as well as the other stakeholders, be it the frontline team, potentially external vendors, revise the strategy, take on that feedback, and then implement that revised strategy back. And you almost have to continue that cycle every time something changes. Mm-hmm. As a leader and as the person who's probably owning the strategy as a whole, where that leadership quality will come out is if there are potentially challenges or there potentially missteps, they need to own that and almost come back and say, actually, this hasn't worked, this has not worked, this is why it's not worked, and then take that as part of that feedback and then ensure that what is happening in the future is being done right. And that's where the leadership bit is truly important, because no one's got it right first time. When we don't really know what's going on, there's always going to be mistakes. But a true leader will own that mistake and then implement those actions almost immediately, other than sort of sitting around for 3 to 4 days, sort of working out, okay, what do we do now?
Awesome. Thank you so much. Nick?
Yeah, I'm just nodding my head, agreeing with what everyone else has been saying, because I think that's really important to take ownership. The experience at the Design Museum has been similar to that. I think another element to kind of build on what's been said is that ability to be agile as a management team, and to see where you will see very quickly where your strengths and your weaknesses are. If you do a SWOT analysis, and it would be great to put yourselves in a position where you can really focus on how you're going to tackle these things from a strategic level, and how that sort of cascades down through the organization, particularly if you're going to have people who are furloughed and others who aren't. So you are you can end up with people taking on multiple sets of responsibilities. So it's kind of thinking smartly about how you're delegating those responsibilities to manage the crisis. And I think agility just loops back into that. How quickly can you learn from adapting new processes or new structure even, and how do you make the most of that?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, all of you. I think as well, flexibility is very, very key in kind of this kind of crisis management. Before, it's been very rigid. Okay, this is what you do, la 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 la, and then all of a sudden, COVID hits, and it just kind of throws it out. This has been thrown out, and we've had to work in different ways, especially in the tourist attractions industry. We work front of house. We don't normally work back of house. We don't work at home. So it's kind of adjusting to that as well with the furlough scheme as well. So I know a lot of people kind of have been struggling with that. But hopefully there'll be a light where we can all come back to front of house and meet and greet and delight our guests when they come through. Fingers crossed that day will come soon, hopefully. All right, that leads me on to the next question. And we're going to start with Neil on this question. So this is kind of an interesting question I want to ask you. So it's how do tourist attractions deal with millennials and Generation Z when handling a crisis? This is kind of both with visitors and employees. Does management need to kind of change their approach based on the generations to communicate and interact with people?
I would say it definitely does. And I think, going back to the first example, when you take a fire alarm, that is a very, in an incident management perspective, that is a very autocratic structure in terms of one person will lead and they will tell people what to do. But people understand actually that I'm being told what to do because for my safety. The challenge which COVID has really thrown up is, and you will all have been very familiar with this because it's usually a comment that's shown on sort of BBC News, is people don't understand government guidance, or they don't feel that it's clear enough. And what my experience has very much shown is this hasn't been the type of crisis where you just write a procedure, tell the procedure, and then people will follow it. Because there's a great deal of uncertainty and there's a great deal of lack of knowledge. And what I think with these groups, who probably make up the vast majority of those who work in attractions, not all of them, but a lot of them, is when people follow a process or a policy that is written the best is when they actually understand fundamentally what the reason why that has been written. So when we talk about things like the government do about isolation periods or contacts, and it's all well and good telling people you are a contact, therefore you have to isolate. But if people don't understand what a contact is, they're not going to be able to follow what the guidance is. And this kind of goes back to this theory regarding the younger generations, in that they're probably less inclined to follow what would be deemed a typical corporate structure. They are more curious and challenging, rightly so, of maybe typical ways of working. So they will always want to know why. And from giving training out and from speaking out to other colleagues is, once you get the team to understand why X process is in place, it actually equips them a lot better for when a deviation to the example that's been given. So if we look at rule of 6, which was a thing for 5 to 6 weeks, then it moved to single households, then it moved to bubbles. It allows the team to almost be able to make the right decision without having been given the safe system of work because the process, because they understand the theory behind what those things are trying to achieve in the first place.
Excellent. Nick?
Yeah, do you know, I have to be the person who challenges this question, Carlton, because when I first read it, and actually until probably very, very recently, I looked at the question and thought, but why? And I say that because a large majority of the place where I work is made up of people from those generations. So I'm actually, being someone who's not quite a millennial, I'm about 20 days, too old to be a millennial. I don't fit in that category. So I'm sort of the odd man out. So it's quite a youthful organization that I work for. And it sort of stumped me. It left me challenged, thinking, well, how can I think about this process? How can I think about this question? How can I give some relevance to it? Actually, I think, Neil, you've kind of articulated quite well what I wanted to say, which is it's bringing people to an understanding. Some people have inquisitive minds, and I think younger generations now have more sort of inquisitive minds, and they want to know why things happen and to give them context. And I think that context build is really important in any scenario. And it sort of made me realize, and I'm not saying this to sort of blow the trumpet of the Design Museum, but we do try to communicate as openly and transparently as possible with our teams, front of house, back of house as well, to give that context. And I think it is very important. If you sort of, there's that sort of phrase, do you lead from the front or do you lead from behind? And depending on sort of who you are as a manager, but who you are as an organization, your culture, I think part of that sort of interlinks, which might sound weird and abstract, but having the understanding of the context as to why an organization is doing something the way it is makes all the difference. And I'm perhaps not articulating myself particularly well, but I think the key message is context, context, context. You can't bring people with you. You can't ask them to do what you would do if you don't give them the context.
Awesome. Thank you. Rachel.
Yeah, I have to agree with Nick. I was initially quite challenged by this question as well. I was kind of like, what are we meant to do, like crisis communications via TikTok or something? Like what's what are we meant to do? But then I realized that I am a millennial. And so actually it's, when you kind of look into the research in terms of the generations that actually now probably museums make up the majority of our work, the vast majority of our workforce, I would say, it is, you can see things coming out. So this is probably the crisis where we've had the most millennials and Gen Zs in the workforce. And that is very much reflected on the amount of communication, I think, that's gone on. A lot of the, I mean, first of all, when you talk about a crisis communications, normally you're talking about very, as Neil said, sort of autocratic structures. And that's because crises initially are very pragmatic things. And if you're saying to somebody, evacuate the building, there isn't really much room for, maneuver in that. But as the crisis gets more long-term, of course, as COVID has, we know that the generations that are in museums now want to feel more involved. And I recognize that in myself. I am technically a millennial. And so I've always liked to feel really involved in the organizations I've worked in, especially when I was working front of house. I was always that person that wanted to know more about why we were doing something. And so we have seen a lot more communication flowing between museums and heritage sites and their staff. And it's not just been about, this is what's happening with the business. There's also been that social side as well, obviously partly to combat the isolation that COVID has inflicted on all of us. But I think what's really interesting, because these generations are so connected anyway, a lot of that social communications has been quite organic. And so a lot of the people that I spoke to in my research, they said, well, yeah, we kind of ask people how they want to communicate with. And some people have their own WhatsApp groups or had their own, Zoom nights or quizzes, like Carlton, we did in the Visitor Experience Forum. And lots of different, it's almost like some organizations try to impose specific communication channels on staff, but actually there was a real grassroots, organic, making their own individual sort of social contact bubbles, I guess. There was a lot of that happening. So a lot of kind of social organic communication happening within this crisis that sort of speaks to, I guess, the fact that there's more millennials and Gen Z people in these organizations than there was before. I would say, another thing as well is professional development opportunities. We know that these are generations who are very keen to always be trying to stretch themselves and develop their professional skills. And so I would say it's really important that during this year where, perhaps not much has happened in terms of professional development, it's really important to still make sure that there are those opportunities for example, front of house staff to keep learning new skills and keep developing. I think the one caveat I want to make, because I read some of the information that you sent around, Carlton, about the kind of the Forbes research in terms of what do millennials want. There's quite a big focus on the fact that money isn't the primary driver for what we do, and that's true. But I'd say that those articles are obviously written at a time where there is not a massive COVID-related financial crisis looming. And so for many staff, actually, there isn't a choice about whether or not money is important. You got to pay rent, you got to pay the bills. And if you're on temporary contract or out of work, then, or having a pay cut, then that is going to become more important than it was before. And it isn't that millennials feel that money is important, so they're going to work for nothing or they're going to work for a pay cut. Actually, what we're going to see happening is a lot of people leaving the industry because of that. So I think we need to kind of lean on the research, certainly, but be aware that circumstances have changed as well.
Yeah, totally understand that. So I just kind of wanted to pick back on a question on what you're mentioning. Do you think that because of COVID, has generations blurred their lines in a sense of millennials are now understanding how boomers are working and vice versa when kind of dealing with a crisis? Because I know, Rachel, you mentioned about like WhatsApp and all that kind of groups and stuff. Have they blurred?
I guess in some ways, tech people have got more au fait with different technologies that might not necessarily have happened before. I wouldn't be able to say necessarily if it's a generational blurring, but I definitely think that the lines between kind of your personal life and your work life have become blurred. And in some ways that's can be quite challenging, but in other ways it's been really nice to be able to actually learn a bit more about our colleagues and their houses and what they've got on their walls, and you know, their family situation, the kids, the cat sitting on the keyboard, you know, all that stuff has, I think, helped us to understand our colleagues better and be a bit more empathetic towards their situation. So that leads to some sort of, you know, cooperation between the generations. Great. I'm not sure that I can necessarily say that's definitively happened, but I think there has been a growth in, yeah, empathy and connection a little bit.
Awesome. That leads us on to our next question very nicely. Nick, I'm going to get you to answer this one first. So how do you keep your teams motivated and connected during a crisis? So we're kind of talking about back of house and front of house. What works and what doesn't, would you say?
Very bluntly, brutal honesty and finding the humor in the situation to keep people upbeat. That's my top line there.
Awesome.
But that is how it's been happening. Finding that there are, you know, front of house teams tend to be the biggest teams in an organization, and they come from, you know, so many different backgrounds with so many different viewpoints on things, and they're all there to try and make a difference because they, you know, they want to sort of share their passion and they want to be involved. They care about the organization, which is what, you know, we've been talking about already. So to have that team sort of come to you on a regular basis, some work on permanent contracts, so some are going to be there more regularly than others, having them sort of making them aware of the situation, and just being upfront with them and being transparent and having that discussion with them. Well, you know, X is happening, this is happening, understanding that we're all, you know, in the same boat. Sort of jingoistic phrase that I'm not really a fan of, but you know, we are all working for the same organization. We do have the same goal, but we all are suffering from the same external challenges at the moment. And also, you know, that goes for back of house staff as well. You may be working in an office environment that's sort of slightly disconnected with the front of house team. You might be working in an open plan office, or, you know, you may be sort of jumping across from the front of house environment to an office environment. And I think understanding both, we're in quite a unique position as sort of visitor experience management, in that we're able to see both sides of the fence, and the attitudes are really, you know, they're very similar, and I think that's great in the sense that everyone obviously has a similar perspective on things, but to be able to just speak openly and candidly with teams, and just let them know that, you know, we're doing everything we can, you know, as an organization. The agility that I was mentioning earlier is very important, that we are being receptive to changes, that we're trying to, you know, make the best decisions possible. But also, you know, that's sort of one layer of it. You know, people need to feel comfortable with the work environment that they're in. But also, as you can probably gather, I'm a clown. So I will always try and make a joke. I'll always find, you know, the silly thing or the upbeat thing. Tensions need to be relieved. There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of anxiety. There can be a lot of negative energy in the workplace at the moment, and that spans across any sector. And I think being able to hold the mirror up at yourselves and have a laugh, I think, is really important, and just accept that some of these things are outside of our control. What can we do to make this space that we're in, that we cohabit, the most pleasant space that we can be in, and how can we keep the mood upbeat?
Awesome. So humor, big part.
Humor and just being upbeat and engaging with people, interacting with as many people as possible, as frequently as possible, because I think, you know, lockdown 1, was so prolonged and so intense for people that, you know, it gave rise to a lot of negative energy, but you know, mental health was affected. A lot of people, there was a lot of uncertainty what was going to happen longer term. And then we kind of moved into a state, okay, well, now we're going to reopen gradually. And I think people started to feel, oh, okay, I'm going to move back to a sense of normality. And as we were sort of saying earlier, we have kind of stopped and reverted back to a lockdown scenario. That's not good for people's health. That's not good for people's mental health. We have to acknowledge that. And I think we, as managers, have a responsibility to kind of acknowledge that we have, you know, we are responsible for people. And we're part of a family. I like to sort of say we're part of a family. And every member of the family brings something different to the table, and to make sure that they're feeling okay, to make sure that they're in a positive state of mind is really important.
Awesome. Neil?
So I think, again, going back to something I mentioned a little bit earlier on, I mean, I think the last sort of 6 to 12 months have been a huge learning curve for the industry. But, you know, I think if we all look back on a personal perspective, you'll think I've probably learned more through this than I will have done for years on end. And I think one thing, again, talking about those typical incidents that we may manage, and these ones, is when you want to engage people, the typical British stiff upper lip, you know, I'm leading this strategy, therefore I always know what the right answer is, just doesn't work. And what genuinely I found is that people engage more with people who are willing to be human beings. So that having that vulnerability when you're speaking to people, and if someone comes, what I find, if someone says, you know, I've heard that the government are going to come out with this new piece of legislation, what do you think? And sometimes I've just been very honest and said, at the moment, I just don't know. I need to see what they're actually going to say. Whereas, you know, go back to that typical fire alarm, you know, maybe a more severe incident, you have to have that sense of absolute understanding, because you're going to go into an autocratic structure. You need to do what I say when for your own safety. And I've really found that vulnerability it's about being honest. And, you know, we talk about fatigue and we talk about mental health. When you're having these human being conversations, as you would with anybody else, you do have that connection and you do have that motivation, because the team are thinking, well, he's just the same as us. Whereas again, if you think about maybe a corporate structure from the 1980s, when it's, well, I would never speak to that person because they're above me, that I just don't think that needs to exist anymore. And that is really, I feel, helped with getting that engagement. And that's actually, you know, going back to the previous question around millennials, they appreciate that more, because they're not the sort of people that want to hear the corporate line or want to hear the holding statement that maybe we would have got away with in the early 2000s. They want brutal honesty. And I don't think anyone can sit on either this call or any call and say, as soon as the government mentioned something, you knew exactly what that meant for your business. You needed to wait 2 or 3 days before the website was updated.
Yeah, great. Thank you, John. And Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, all I can say is really that everything that everybody has said has been completely borne out by the research. One of the kind of top gripes was getting information from senior management that was vague, or you know, the people would just rather know what the situation is, even if the situation is we don't know what's going to happen yet. And so people want that honesty and they want that clarity. And that's been something that maybe some people have had to grapple with, because maybe sometimes as managers we're used to being able to have the answers when our staff come to us, but actually in this situation we didn't. And actually one interviewee that I spoke to said that in his organization there was almost a bit of a thing of the front of house staff always thinking that, you know, the management were keeping things from them, and actually this was a real opportunity to say, look, you know as much as we do, we're going to work this out together, you know, we're all on the same page here. So I think that in a way has been a nice opportunity to clear the slate and learn together. And I think the other important thing in terms of keeping people motivated, and I'm talking particularly about front of house teams here, is trying to involve them in the decisions and the planning as much as possible. So particularly when we look at reopening, with the first kind of wave of reopenings that we had, there was a bit of anxiety beforehand about, what was the front of house job going to be? It's changed so much now. We're asking people to police behaviour. We're asking people to wear masks and visors. It's all a very different role from what they've done before. And I think where that worked well in terms of front of house being motivated along that journey was when front of house staff were given the opportunity to be really involved in that planning. So right from the design in the planning, the delivery, right through to like reviewing how it's gone, it's really, really critical that people are involved in a genuine way in trying to kind of figure out how their work environment is going to look and how they're going to be able to do their job. So I think for me, it's clear communication and genuine consultation and collaborative working.
Okay, interesting. Just a side question to that. So regarding like your crisis management plans, do you have anything in place in how you communicate with your staff in your actual playbook? Is that written up or and what does that look like?
So I guess, like probably most organizations, the crisis management plan that we have at Historic Royal Palaces and previously when I worked at the Natural History Museum as well, and everywhere I've worked actually, were really was split into two bits. So you had your crisis management and then you had your business continuity. And you kind of assumed that these would be two different phases. So you had your emergency and then you had let's get back to business. Now that's been completely, I don't know why I did that and I immediately regret it. Sorry, it's better than that.
It's okay. Yeah, very true.
Those have now been completely merged, and so we're trying to do business continuity, but then we're dragged back to crisis management again when there's another lockdown. So what I'm saying is, no, I don't think there was a long-term communication plan for communicating with staff because nobody anticipated this length and this weird merging of crisis. I think that is something that we need to plan for going forward. But as I mentioned earlier, some of that communication has been really organic and come from the staff themselves, and I think that's okay. That's more genuine in a way.
That's great. I think that's really important to kind of review what's actually happening in your organizations and kind of put that in your communication plan. So if that means setting up a WhatsApp group with all of your staff or Facebook group or social media kind of link, then that could be part of your communication plan for a crisis management.
Yeah. And actually it's so important to capture all the learning from right now as well, because yes. Patrick Lagadek, who's a scholar that I read a lot of in terms of crisis management, he called crisis an abrupt and brutal audit. And I love that because it is quite harsh, but at the same time, it highlights how much of a learning opportunity this is at this moment in time. And so when I was on furlough, one of the things I was doing was carrying out crisis management audits for different organizations. So actually doing like a sort of wash up for how crisis management went through COVID. And I think that's a really important thing for every organization to do, because there's going to be so much to learn out of what we've been through this year. And, you know, and it can happen again just like that, just like it has now. So it's important to gather it all and try and learn from it for next time.
Awesome. Okay. I'm just conscious of time. This is a brilliant conversation. I wish I can go on for ages more, but I'm going to go for our last question today, and this is going to be open to everybody. So the question is, what problems do you think organizations are overlooking when planning for a crisis? So I'm looking for your top tips of what works and what doesn't work with this question. So anybody can jump in.
It's difficult because I would never be able to comment on whether I think an organization misses it. But what I would certainly say, and this has been growing in significant importance probably in the last decade, but the absolute takeaway I think from lockdown 1 and lockdown 2 is the severe importance of managing your team's mental health. And we all have crisis documentation, and we all have business continuity plans, and we all know what we should do. And I think if you look back at what some groups may have done in 2010, probably that aftercare, mental health, looking after aspect wouldn't be as prominent as it should have been. And now if we look at how probably incidents and crisis will be managed moving forward, mental health is going to be on the top, if not close to the top, because we've never had a crisis that's lasted this long. And I think if those brutally honest conversations, Nick, that you mentioned with the team. I think more people now would be willing to admit that the biggest challenge for them during lockdown has been coping with their own mental health, either through uncertainty around their roles, through isolation, through even people who are continuing to work may only have a single room. So it's almost that cabin fever aspect. And certainly a personal takeaway that I will always be talking about, and I'm sure many other businesses are in the same boat, is that as well as having a communication plan that is robust enough to manage with COVID, because most places probably didn't have a communication plan that spanned 4 months, is actually those mental health resources are even more important than they used to be. And I've been very fortunate working for Merlin. We've always had assets that we can give to the teams, and those assets are great, but mental health is not about giving someone an asset, it's about having honest conversation. And again, that human-to-human contact, that human-to-human conversation is essential. But where businesses all struggled with the sheer number of people and the sheer volume of their teams that were on furlough, there's just not always necessarily enough people to have those conversations. And it is a huge thing, and there's not many good things that can be taken from COVID, but if mental health awareness and mental health prominence is one of them, then that's maybe one silver lining that can be taken from what has been a truly horrible experience.
Awesome. Nick?
Stole my thunder, Neil. No, I couldn't have put that better myself. Yeah, mental health is a massive thing. And what else? What else can we look at as organizations? I think the communications plan, so I've had a chance to speak to a couple of colleagues across the industry, and having that solid, you just touched on it there, the communications plan in place for X number of months during lockdown is great, but actually do all organizations have a communications plan? What does that look like? And focusing on the internal, I know it sounds quite basic, but actually focusing on the internal communications plan as much as the external communications plan. It just sounds so straightforward, but I think it is crucial to really ram that home, that we're businesses, we're organizations, we're people, and it's people working alongside people, and making, as an organization, sharing information transparently and as critically as we need to internally for staff is really important, as much as it is to share to the outside world on our social media platforms, on our websites, on our ticketing sites, or what have you, that there is a major change, and continue watching this space for more updates, and this is the why, and this is how you can support, and this is, they're both equally, the internal and the external, they're both equally as important, because ultimately we need, as organizations, to survive through this, and we want the world to know that our organizations still exist and will continue to exist in the future.
Brilliant. Rachel?
Yeah, I totally support everything that has been said, and I think that one of the biggest realizations that's come out of this is how long-lasting crisis can be, and the impacts that will have in terms of mental health and kind of energy as well. I think from a practical kind of planning point of view, I think that people, when they're setting up crisis management plans, kind of fall into one of two camps. And one is where you try and predict everything that's going to happen and write procedures for every single incident that you can think of. And the other one is where it's more about the team and decision-making structures and who's going to do what. And I think that the most common problem is probably falling more into one camp than the other. You kind of need to have a bit of a balance. The problem with trying to predict every single thing that might happen is that the one thing that you haven't predicted is the thing that will happen, which is what happened to most of us this year. But the other side of it, where it's too much on kind of like the decision making is what people do, is that it does rely on having the right people in place, and what if those people are not available, and the people who come on site to deal with it have got no idea what to do. So you kind of need like a healthy marriage of those two sides of things. I think that's kind of what the most useful crisis management plan would look like. But then the other thing I think is that it's pointless to have a really great crisis management plan if you don't practice managing crises. And that's a difficult thing to do, obviously, because we don't get a lot of practice with a real crisis. But one thing that I really would recommend organizations do is those kind of very regular tabletop exercises where you sit down as a team and say, imagine this happened, you know, and it doesn't need to be, it can be aliens landing, it can be a zombie apocalypse, it doesn't really matter what it is. It's just about flexing those crisis management muscles, because just like any other muscle, if you don't use it, you won't have it when you need it. So it's just about practicing making those decisions and thinking critically and proactively. It's a real skill, crisis management, and it's one that we probably don't practice enough.
Awesome. Thank you so much for them answers to your questions. So that kind of wraps up our crisis management talk for today. Before we go, I just want to get everybody back on the screen just to explain where we can find you if anybody wants to get in contact. So let's start with Neil. Where can we find you online?
So I can be found on LinkedIn, and I would generally reach out a hand to anyone, you know, anyone who wants to talk about this from particularly from our industry or otherwise, and just wants to have a general conversation about practices. Because one thing that I've learned through this is sometimes you can have that period where you feel a bit lonely because you're writing practices and procedures and policies for people sometimes without others to talk through. So if anyone ever does want to just have a conversation, then that door is absolutely open. So message me on there, and we can absolutely have a conversation, because I'm sure I'll learn even more from you than you will from me. So the door is always open.
Awesome. Nick?
Yeah, likewise. LinkedIn, as I'm sure we're all on LinkedIn. Find me there. Happy to talk anything with your experience. And you know, outside of work, I could do a shameless plug for my radio shows and my voiceover work, but you know, I will. Because it's no, seriously, or let's put the ego aside. I'm, as I think I've probably kind of highlighted through this, I'm very much about you know, people talking with people, and I'm very much driven by music. So you could, in theory, find me on Instagram, Nikki Bubbles, all one word with a Z. Yes, I said it. And I do shameless self-promotion. It's very music related. I'm very much into music as a form of healing and therapy. So if that interests you all, find me and we can chat about work, non-work. We're 21st century now. The lines between work and outside of work have blurred, so I'm fine with that.
Awesome. Brilliant. Rachel?
I think Nick just wants some friends.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm the same. Twitter, LinkedIn, and Twitter as well. What I'd really like to do is signpost people to the website. So the Recovery Room is where you can find all the findings from the research that I did over the summer. So all those interviews with people talking about how they experienced COVID at their museum or heritage site, which is just, I think, such invaluable information for us. There's also practical resources. So there's training scenarios for your crisis management team. So if you want to just print them off and do one every couple of months, that's a great thing to do. There's things like shutdown templates for your site. So lots of good training resources and practical resources and research for this weird time that we're going through. Oh, and it's the recoveryroomblog.com.
Good plug. Well done. And for me, you can find me on Instagram and LinkedIn and Twitter. But also you can find me at the Visitor Experience Forum. Or you just type that into Google and you'll pop up. And we are a group of individuals who work in the tourist attractions industry that kind of comes together to share experiences. And what's great about this group, everyone is a member of the Visitor Experience Forum. So thank you very much for being a member, and hopefully we can see you on the other side. Again, thank you so much. It's been a great insight of crisis management. And yes, to everybody who's watching, please feel free to get in contact with us. We are more than welcome to support you during these challenging times. Guys, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Carlton.
Thanks, everyone.